Okay, well, hello and good afternoon or good morning to you all. My name is Ian Langford. I'm the Security and Defence Plus Executive Director. The Security and Defence Plus is an alliance between three world-class universities across the three AUKUS member countries. That is Arizona State University out of the United States, the University of New South Wales out of Australia, and King's College London out of the United Kingdom. The purpose of our webinar today is to really release the AUKUS Briefing Book, which as a frame of reference to you all really does articulate the history of the AUKUS arrangement since 2021. It provides primary and secondary sources from each of the three AUKUS member countries, broader commentary both in and across media as well as government and departmental releases, and some of the progress made so far, as well as the ambition that is charted over the coming years to realise, in the first instance, Pillar 1 via the optimal pathway for the realisation of a submarine capability for Australia that relies on nuclear propulsion, but also contributes more broadly to security and defence across the Indo-Pacific. And then Pillar 2, which is really focused on emerging technology offsets and asymmetries, which will require the research collaboration across government, across industry, and across research and higher education if, as a whole of nation, the three AUKUS countries are to deliver on the kind of technology and opportunities that will be resident in the coming decades for us all. It's my great privilege today to introduce three distinguished panel members for this discussion, each in their own way representing their AUKUS constituency. I will introduce them all shortly, but firstly, just to give everyone an operational context, it's worth us just reflecting on where we sit now in the operating environment and how we might like to describe circumstances and arrangements across the coming decades. To quote from US President Biden at the US Coast Guard's Academy's 140th commencement address, he says we're now in the early years of a decisive decade for America and the world. In terms of geopolitical competition between major powers will be set. Window of opportunity to deal with shared threats like climate change will narrow drastically. The actions we take now will shape whether this period is known as an age of conflict and discord or the beginning of a more stable and prosperous future. We face two strategic challenges. First is that the post-Cold War era is definitively over and a competition is now underway between major powers to shape what comes next. No nation is better positioned to succeed in this competition than the United States, as long as we work in common cause with those who share our vision of a world that is free, open, secure, and prosperous. That means the foundational principles of self-determination, territorial integrity, and political independence must be respected. International institutions must be strengthened. Countries must be free to determine their own foreign policy choices. Information must be allowed to flow freely. Universal human rights must be upheld, and the global economy must operate on a level playing field and provide opportunity for all. The second is that while this competition is underway, people all over the world are struggling to cope with the effects of shared challenges that cross borders, whether it's climate change, food insecurity, communicable diseases, terrorism, energy shortages, or inflation. These shared challenges are not marginal issues that are secondary to geopolitics. They're at the very core of national and international security and must be treated as such. By their very nature, these challenges require governments to cooperate if they are to solve them. But we must be clear-eyed that we have to tackle these challenges within a competitive international environment, the will to do so, where heightening geopolitical competition, nationalism, and populism render this cooperation even more difficult and will require us to think and act in new ways. There are equivalent statements echoing the same sentiments out of the recently released National Defence Strategy here in Australia, and much of the same thoughts and commentary on the worldview exists in the UK in the form of recent foreign policy updates and their own Defence Integrated Review. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great privilege to introduce our three panel members today. Our first is Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins, who is the current Under-Secretary for Arms Control and International Security. Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins has served as the Under-Secretary for State for Arms Control and International Security since July 22, 2021. As the Under-Secretary, she oversees 3 bureaus: the Arms Control, Deterrence and Stability Bureau, the International Security and Non-Proliferation Bureau, and the Political Military Affairs Bureau. In addition, as of May 23, Secretary of State Antony Blinken named Under-Secretary Jenkins as the senior official to lead the department's efforts on AUKUS implementation. Under-Secretary Jenkins has the honour of being the first African-American to serve as an Under-Secretary of State. Under-Secretary Jenkins has a remarkable career of public service, is an accomplished academic. She's also a Naval Reserve officer. She's served previously in the Obama administration. She's led diplomatic efforts to promote the global health security agenda. She's the founder, executive director, and board chair of Women of Colour Advancing Peace and Security. She's worked at the Ford Foundation as the program officer for US Foreign and Security Policy. She's also served as a counsel on National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States, otherwise known as the 9/11 Commission. She's a lead staff member coordinating research, interviews, and preparing commission reports in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. She's a legal advisor to US Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, and she's an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law School, the School of Foreign Service, George Washington University, and also has numerous other university appointments throughout the United States. She's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Ambassador, welcome, and I look forward to your comments shortly. Our next guest is Dr. John Blaxland, who's the Director of the Australian National University North America Liaison Office and a Professor of International Security and Intelligence Studies in the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs, College of Asia and the Pacific at the Australian National University. He's the first Australian recipient of the US Department of Defence Minerva Research Initiative grant. He's the author of numerous books on military history, intelligence, and international security studies. He's also a senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy and a fellow of the Royal Society of New South Wales, a former military intelligence officer, to include being the defence attaché to Thailand and Myanmar, an exchange officer at the Defence Intelligence Agency in Washington, DC. He was the head of the SDSC and director of the ANU Southeast Asia Institute. He also teaches the much famous Honeypots and Overcoats Australian Intelligence in the World and supervises PhD students on top of all of that. Thanks very much, John, for joining us today. And our last guest is Dr. Alessio Patalano, who is the Professor of War and Strategy in East Asia at the Department of War Studies, King's College London. Professor Patalano is also the co-director of the Centre for Grand Strategy, where he leads the newly established Indo-Pacific program. He's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, a visiting professor at the Japan Maritime Commander Staff College, and an adjunct fellow at the Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies, Temple University, Japan. Alessio holds affiliations at think tanks, Policy Exchange, Royal United Services Institute, and the Council on Geostrategy. He's also a visiting fellow at the Royal Navy Centre for Strategic Studies, non-resident fellow, Royal Australian Navy Sea Power Centre, and has held affiliations at the Aoyama Gakuin University, at the National Defence Academy and the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Japan. In 2022, Professor Patalano became the first special advisor on the Indo-Pacific to the Foreign Affairs Committee of the UK Parliament, and in 2023 he also became the first academic to be awarded a commendation of the Ambassador of Japan to the UK for his outstanding contribution to the advancement of UK-Japan ties in defence and security. Alessio, again, thank you very much for joining us today. I think our audience would agree that this panel is most esteemed and most qualified to speak on the topics of the day and really perhaps reflect on what the purpose of the briefing book is in that broader context around bringing AUKUS as an element of statecraft across the 3 participating countries, to include other perspectives from Japan in this instance, and what it might mean for the global security order and those common interests that each country shares. What I'll do now is I'll offer some opening remarks with Under-Secretary Jenkins to really kick us off. And again, we'd appreciate any comments and perspectives on any of the issues I've outlined today, and more specifically, what your views on AUKUS in terms of progress, aims and ambitions, and where you think we're doing well up until this point. Under Secretary Jenkins, thanks very much, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you for that very nice introduction. It's really great to be here to talk about AUKUS. I'm really happy to hear about the briefing book. Looking forward to that as well. And really nice to be here with all the panelists. As you heard, I am the Undersecretary for Arms Control and National Security at the U.S. Department of State. And I also want to thank you, before I say anything more, for Defense and Security Plus for hosting this event. So AUKUS has come a very long way since it was started back 2.5 years ago. And it's wonderful to see the role of universities and academia that are growingly continuing to see your interest in this area, and also such an integral part of the AUKUS ecosystem. And what's really good about this event is I've been trying to tell people just about, how important this part of AUKUS is. I don't think it still has gotten enough attention, regarding the role of academia, the human side of AUKUS. And so this is great because I think we want to continue to do these kind of things to highlight just how important the role of universities and academia are. As many of you know, Australia and UK are longstanding allies and partners who are committed to working together to actualize AUKUS and deepen our partnership that goes back for so long. These new authorities that we're working on will allow for unparalleled levels of security cooperation between our governments and industries. An endeavor of this size and scale will have challenges, and we've seen many challenges already as we continue to promote and actualize AUKUS. But we will continue to work trilaterally together to overcome the challenges, and there's so much that we've overcome already. AUKUS is an example of demonstrating our firm commitment to our international partnership. It is a key line of effort in our national security, defense, and Indo-Pacific strategies. AUKUS remains committed to setting the highest nuclear non-proliferation standard, and it maintains strong bilateral, multilateral support in all three countries. In recent weeks, AUKUS partners have continued to take many steps forward, following the President and trilateral leaders' clear intent to engage others in Pillar 2 advanced capability projects as our work progresses. We will undertake consultations in 2024 with prospective partners regarding areas where they can contribute to and benefit from this historic work. To be clear, we are not planning to expand cooperation on Pillar 1, which is focused on assisting in Australia's acquisition of conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarines. But AUKUS partners have developed principles and models for additional partner engagement in specific Pillar 2 projects. We announced that Japan will be the first to be consulted. We do not have a timeline to share about additional partnerships for Japan or any other countries with which we are consulting. It is critical that we conduct a deliberative process, and we will share more information once that process has been concluded. We understand the importance of enhancing security standards to protect our sensitive technology as we break new frontiers on developing emerging technologies together. Collectively, we agree that robust consultation with industry is important to complete before the exemptions take effect to maximize its potential use and effectiveness. The rule is currently on the Federal Register for public comment, and we look forward to robust engagement in the weeks ahead with industry stakeholders and beyond. We fully expect to finalize new trade exemptions based on stakeholder input over the course of the next 120 days. So it is time to keep accelerating, building on the significant steps we have taken in the past 2.5 years. So I thank you for your time, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ambassador. Now, just turning to yourself, John, as you know, announced in September 21, AUKUS partnership between Australia, the UK and US is intended to strengthen diplomatic security and defence cooperation across the Indo-Pacific. From your perspective, sitting there in the US, but also having that really deep understanding of Australian and UK defence and security issues, how do you see, in an introductory context, progress to this point?
So, yeah, thank you very much, Ian. It's a great honour and a privilege to be here with such an esteemed panel. Thrilled to be part of this. It's a really important conversation being had here. And what you guys are doing with the Defence and Security Plus Network is to be commended. A little bit jealous of what King's College and UNSW and Arizona State University pulling off. Mindful, of course, that I'm not part of that formally. My alma mater is UNSW, but I'm also an ANU grad and now a long-standing employee of the Australian National University, tenured prof there, of course, for quite some time now. But the thing is that this is something that's bigger than any one small grouping of universities. This is something bigger than the so-called group of 8 primary research universities in Australia. This is something that is a visionary engagement constructively across 3 nations. But where we are today, it's really interesting to step back a bit to reflect on where this all started, because it started with a controversy over the dumping of the French submarine proposal and project. Which came, with this deal that, the cynics saw as a ScoMo, Bojo, Joby deal, right? Scott Morrison, Boris Johnson and Joe Biden getting together and stitching together some kind of fancy deal. It's like, oh, come on, folks, what kind of dodgy conspiratorial arrangement is this? Well, when you unpack this, the superficial kind of critique, which is an understandable one given the way it was sprung on us, actually belies something really substantive beneath the surface that's worth reflecting on. And it's something, and I'm going to be gratuitous here, Ian, and I like to do this. It's something that I talked about in my book, Revealing Secrets, an unofficial history of Australian signals intelligence and the advent of cyber, that I co-wrote with Claire Bergen. This trusted collaboration over 80 plus years at the top secret level, intergenerational trusted collaboration between the partners in the Five Eyes relationship, is the context in which the President of the United States can have a proposal put before him that is unprecedented, unheralded, and outrageous on one level, and he thinks that's a good idea. Wow, right? How on earth does that happen? It happens in this context of deep, trusted, intergenerational collaboration. Now, of course, if you take away that level, and if you take away the kind of the froth and bubble of the critique over the ScoMo, Bojo, Joby deal, you get actually something that's technically quite profound. And that is that while the Collins-class submarine is as good as you can get with an with a diesel electric submarine, the bottom line is it doesn't matter anymore. What do you mean, John? Well, the thing is that for a big country like Australia, if you want to transit from Fremantle to any other port around Australia, let alone going anywhere else, you can't do it stealthily anymore. What do you mean? Well, of course, all along we know that they've had to surface to at least snort, to recharge the batteries by turning on the diesel engines and sucking in air and expelling exhaust, right? That's been well established. But what people haven't quite got their heads around, I think, is this phenomenon of almost saturation, low Earth, polar orbit, Chinese satellites that are enabling the PLA, the People's Liberation Army of China, to pick out Australian diesel submarines when they come up for a snort. How is that possible? The wake of that snorkel in the ocean is detectable with AI, with sophisticated, almost saturation coverage, with pattern analysis of the routes of Australian Collins submarines, which they've been able to do for the last 30, 40 years. They know when they snort, they know where they snort, and they can then focus on doing that and identifying. This is a real problem. This really means that all of a sudden, this does not apply to other countries, by the way, with smaller exclusive economic zones, where you can actually do your operations in your zones and stay submerged. For Australia, you can't get to Darwin and stay stealthy. So what we're seeing is a confluence of the politics with the technology generating an impetus for a transformation. And I think the combination of that trusted collaboration, the technological revolution, the artificial intelligence, the almost saturation low Earth orbit satellites has meant that this has kind of come at just at the right time. Probably should have happened 10 years earlier if we'd thought about it, if we'd been visionary enough about it. But perhaps this is, ironically, Scott Morrison has been criticised for many things, so has Boris Johnson, but their legacy here on the submarine front, on Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, is actually probably their most consequential legacy. One other thing, a couple more things I want to just make. One is about the submarine rotation force west. People are saying, oh, but John, it's going to be 10 years or more before we see Australian submarines. I said, okay, I think you're missing the point. We are already seeing Virginia-class submarines rotating in and out of Fremantle. And of course, that is, I would contend, a game changer. That is actually normalizing something that 20, 30 years ago was quite controversial. A nuclear propulsion submarine coming into Australia in the old days generated some controversy. That controversy has largely dissipated, I would contend. But the other thing that we forget is what we're talking about when we're talking about Fremantle, we're talking about Coburn Sound. Coburn Sound, what are we talking about here? This is where, at the height of the Second World War, from 1943 to 45, we housed about 170 Allied submarines that were absolutely transformative in the effect they had on the ability of Imperial Japan to wage war. And that is because of the direct line from Fremantle up to the Straits, Malacca, Lombok, Sunda, Wetar, and more, and into the South China Sea and beyond. That completely disrupted the ability of Imperial Japan to conduct operations and resupply and support its forces. This is something people have not got their heads around. So when we, I talk about in Revealing Secrets, what my late great colleague Des Ball talked about as the suitable piece of real estate being Pine Gap, right? And I've got a wonderful photo of Pine Gap in there. What this arrangement, the AUKUS deal is putting on the table is a revival, if you like, of that second suitable piece of real estate, Fremantle, Coburn Sound, which is a super enabler for the deterrent effect of the American nuclear propulsion submarines, to which Australia is going to be able to contribute its own fleet in the coming times. That's huge in my view, and I think, and just one perhaps final point I'd make here is that okay, but when is why are we doing this? Is this going to trigger war? Is this going to make war more likely? There is a lot of the argument out there is that war is going to be the prospects of war is heightened by Australia's militarism. I'm thinking, hang on a minute, that's putting the cart well and truly before the horse here. This is something where we are looking to add to the deterrent effect of the combined views of nations that are like-minded, that have shared strategic interests, that are looking to make sure that the order that we've grown to love and cherish is actually sustained. Now, people can say, oh, come on, John, what order? The so-called rules-based global order. Oh, please, give me a break, right? There's so many exceptions to the rule. I think it's worth pointing out, I like to compare it to the Holy Roman Empire, right? Wasn't holy, didn't include Rome, and was barely an empire, right? And yet, when we think about it, we've all benefited. Even China has benefited from the so-called rules-based global order, right? We like it. We don't want it to go away. And what we're trying to do is sustain the model and actually push back to those who are looking to try and take it over. And I think so this is a really important point. We're facing a spectrum of challenges. We're facing what, some people calling it grey zone. I think it's worth thinking about this as a game of unrestricted competition, not unrestricted warfare. I think that's because we in the English language, we have this binary of peace and war. But if we think of this as a continuum of competition and of coercion and of confrontation and of flares going off in front of Australian helicopters and things like that, the deterrent effect is of fundamental importance. We need to be credible in our deterrence, and we need to be coordinated in our deterrence. So I think what we're facing is not a game of chess. And we in the West, we've kind of got a fixation with Clausewitz and Mahan and things like that, and they've all got their place. But I think it's useful to maybe shift our thinking more in terms of Sunza, the great Chinese strategy, for whom the acme of skill is to defeat your adversary without fighting, and the game of Go, in which what you are doing is you're looking to not remove your adversary from the board and then checkmate your king, but to actually flip your adversary, to woo them, to win them over, coerce them, blackmail them, cajole them, persuade them somehow. And if we're going to push back in that space, submarines are a part of that, pillar 1, pillar 2, but it can't be everything. It's got to be much more than that, but it is definitely part of the equation. Okay, I said that was the last point. I lied. I've got one more point to make, and that is this. When we think about the dollar figure, and this is where I think we've caught ourselves up here, 358 billion Australian dollars. That's an outrageous sum of money, John. How can you possibly support that? Well, okay, let's think about this in context. That's over 30 years, folks. What are we going to do on the health, welfare and education front over 30 years in Australia? Well, I did a bit of a quick calculation, and I did the math on this. $9 trillion Australians are going to spend over the next 30 years on health, welfare and education. Okay, that's a shed load of money. We know that. And 358 billion is still a lot of money. But in the context of that health, welfare and education comparison, it kind of puts it more into, I think, into perspective. So yes, it's a load of money. It's a shed load of money, and that we're investing in a capability that seems kind of precarious, but it is incredibly important, I would contend, if we are to retain our independence of foreign policy and ironically, our independence of defence policy as well. We can tease that out later if you like, Ian. Thank you for humouring me. Thank you.
No, thanks very much, John. I mean, I'd agree with everything that you expressed. It's always a useful exercise thinking about Australia's contribution to the Allied undersea warfare campaign in the Pacific of the Second World War, particularly those forward points of disembarkation, with Fremantle being front of mind. So I appreciate that. Also appreciate you mentioning the late, great Des Ball, who was a great friend of the US in the context of his contributions from Australia for statecraft. And, you know, in the broader way that you've talked about Pillar 1, I mean, I would argue that 3 years ago, when you mentioned the words Ohio, Columbia, Virginia, Los Angeles, Dreadnought, Astute, Collins, and SSN AUKUS, being able to link that through a metal torpedo that travels underwater was not a common skill, whereas now people can understand the relationships and the tensions that come with managing all of those different platforms across time in a really important period. So that contribution from yourself is a great way to set the conversation. Really appreciate that. Alessio, just turning to you now, and again, appreciate you sit on a different part of the world that is, you know, the third leg of the AUKUS stool. I'd be really keen on your perspectives around AUKUS and the broader commentary for security and defence in terms of research, education, policy, but also from the UK perspective, how does AUKUS matter in the broader conversation around national security? And what are the priorities do you think pertain to current policy moving forward? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you for asking me to stay the lane of research, because I felt highly outgunned by the firepower of practitioners' experience here coming across. So thank you for the helping hand in that sense. Let me start with because we're gathering together for the launch of the briefing book. So let me start with that, because I think one of the very important things, you know, if anyone listening in were to ask why should I care about the briefing book, I think for me it's first and foremost a one-stop shop. AUKUS has been a very fast evolving, fast-paced in many respects endeavor. It has two pillars that are fairly complex and complicated. And we've seen announcements since the pact was signed in September 2021 that have continued every 6 to 9 months. And so the first challenge really is to how do I make sense of it all? You know, how can I trace back all the various steps in the different directions? Because it covers from nuclear transfer of reactors to hypersonics, quantum, and AI. That's pretty wide canvas, if you want. So in that sense, for me, the first thing to say, the first word here is really for the briefing book in trying to do something that is absolutely essential, whether you are an undergraduate student or a researcher, is bringing under the same umbrella the various different documents and also how they've come out and have come across the three different party members to AUKUS. That sense of a one-stop shop that really gives you an initial idea of the ambition of the pact and the narrative that is crafted around it, as well as, if you're looking at it from a research perspective, the areas that needs further exploration. And that's what I want to go next, because from my perspective, when we're thinking about AUKUS and what AUKUS is doing in terms of research, AUKUS is both the brainchild of international or development in international affairs, as well as a driver of attention and focus towards the things that we really should be thinking about a little bit more. So I'll talk about the three areas which I think speak to that. And then on the back of that, I'll think about, or I'll try to suggest, what are the consequences moving forward to this. First, the three areas. From my perspective, AUKUS captured what had already been bubbling underneath the surface of the strategic studies subfield that is maritime security and maritime strategy broadly defined, a shift from the main focus of the sea as a place where non-state actors do bad things to provide mild annoyance to shipping. And here the thoughts runs to the counter-piracy activities of the 2000. If you 5 years ago, 6 years ago, you'd say maritime security, people would have never thought about fleets sort of going out at sea, contesting potentially freedom of the navigation or sea control. You would have thought about pirates on skiffs trying to sort of Captain Phillips style board some sort of private yacht or indeed shipping. And so AUKUS really captures that shift that now is much more firmly into when we think about the global maritime order on the return of strategy back into why the sea matters, both in terms of the challenge that state-on-state competition presents to freedom of navigation, but also as we are learning in the Red Sea, how proxies of certain state actors, particularly authoritarian regimes, can actually leverage our dependence, the dependence of open economies and societies on the sea, by virtue of keeping us hostage at missile point or joint point, as it were. And there is also, in this respect, coming back into fashion from a research perspective of this idea, what if a crisis sort of reaches a boiling point and it sort of goes into outright war? What does war at sea look like? Have we been thinking about the meaning of retaining, regaining, and contesting sea control? Mind you, that's not a trifling question, because for the better part of the last 25 years, we've assumed we've had sea control. There is, most Western military constructs, not least the United States, we don't do deep strike anymore from the sea because we didn't really have to do it in many respects. And when we did it, it was against second-tier air defense systems, which could be easily knocked out by TLAMs launched by submarines within 72 hours. And here I'm talking about Libya and the case of Libyan air defenses being literally made, if you want, redundant within 72 hours or knocking them down from with TLAMs from somewhere in the adjacent basin. So the first area really is this comeback of the strategic dimension of our understanding of the sea in international affairs in a way that is still tilting the scales. Maritime security still matters, but now is almost becoming ancillary to this broader question of the weaponization of the maritime order for the purpose of pushing a particular view of geopolitics. The second area, which I think more specifically AUKUS is really sort of fleshing out, is this idea of the role of what we would call seabed warfare, or submarine warfare broadly defined, in, again, international politics and contemporary strategy, in two ways. First, by getting us to think to what John was talking about earlier, the role of submarines into maintaining strategic stability, and failing that, contesting sea control or regaining sea control, or literally putting the enemy on a back foot. But also, I think, and this is where the pillar 1, pillar 2 dimension becomes really interesting, is what we can do with a nuclear-powered submarine operating underneath and beneath the waves. The sort of the seabed as a place on its own for future warfare is becoming an increasingly more interesting space. And mind you, John made a point about the fact that if you are anywhere in Australia, if you want to go anywhere on a sub, you need to sail forever and ever. Yes. But there is if you want, the underlying point is that what is the key difference between nuclear-powered submarines and a conventionally powered? It's the endless supply of energy, which means on that piece of kit, you can put any type of combat system and sensors that you want, and you will be able to power them where you're operating them or where you're not operating them and you're recharging them. That's something that makes a significant difference because it gives a sense of control of the seabed domain in a way that we only started to realize because this is a new area that is evolving altogether. So from my perspective, the second area of research that really is bringing back front and center from an academic perspective is how submarine warfare is changing and how seabed warfare is becoming a new area of that. And AUKUS pillar 1, pillar 2 are inherent conversation. Or put it this way, in order to advance on pillar 1 and pillar 2 in the best possible way, you need to have these conversations as well. And the third area of research, which I think is significant, is how it's pushing us to reconceptualize the study of the area of strategic studies pertaining to signaling, political signaling, conventional deterrence, and then the role of technology in future warfare. Because if you think about it, most of our intellectual constructs were for the management of conventional deterrence or indeed political signaling are very much designed around most of them anyway, on land-centric continental spaces. The sea opens up different opportunities. And for a long time, we haven't been thinking about it because for the last 20 years or so, we were engaged into conflicts that were literally the opposite of anything, state on state, maritime, or indeed Asia-Pacific, as it were. Now, today we are in a different space, and I think in that sense, what I personally really look forward to is a number of PhD dissertations trying to get back the likes of Mearsheimer and sort of start to rethink, well, no, that was a great idea, but maybe in a maritime context, it doesn't work that way. And in fairness to John Mearsheimer, he always made the point that his intellectual observations were very much drawn upon a continental space, and therefore he was not sure the extent to which it would apply in a maritime context. So 3 areas of research for me. One is the comeback of the maritime and the strategic in a broader conversation about maritime security. 2, that link between sort of undersea domain and strategic stability. 3, deterrence and intellectual space of deterrence and technology in that context moving forward. What are the 3 consequences of these 3 areas of 3 big sort of buckets of research? I think first and foremost, there is a question of coordination among the 3 party members of AUKUS in terms of how to have existing streams of research converging and creating better synergies with each other. And I think that is not only in terms of the specific elements of, submarine and seabed warfare or maritime security, maritime strategy or deterrence, but also how to create better links between the science and technology communities and the national security communities. Because let's face it, for the better part of the last 20 years, most of the departments focusing on relevant engineering, physics, and science-related places that have significance to the broader AUKUS endeavor have been operating pretty much outside the space of the national security awareness realm. And the same way, the sort of more political science historian side of the equation has been also a little bit in its own camp. So I think both in terms of aligning the three countries and the research conducted in the three countries, as well as getting the different communities more interconnected together. It's a very much an element of synergic coordination that needs to be front and center. And I very much applaud the fact that the Group of Eight started to have a working group on security matters, which I think, for example, should be mirrored also somewhere in the UK and US equivalent. Certainly, I can speak for the Russell Group. It will be a really interesting thing to do, so that then you have these three higher bodies, umbrella sort of components that interact with each other and help the different sort of national streams to come together more seamlessly. The second is a question of cooperation. And that is with close and trusted partners that are not necessarily within the AUKUS dimension and pact, but certainly are ideally placed to become part of the broader family. And here I'm thinking about Japan, and the fact that Japanese universities and the Japanese higher education system is changing considerably and started to understand the importance of reconnecting university research with national security concerns. And of course, Japan, not only through individual conversations with AUKUS members, but also through GCAP, the Global Combat Air Program, is having conversations about the future of disruptive technologies, or indeed quantum AI, hypersonics, in future capabilities. So I can see here a choice. And what is interesting when you think about coordination is, shall we aim for project-to-project sort of cooperation, which obviously is the first port of call, or maybe is there even a bigger ambition, a network of trusted partners that set as an ambition the gold standards of how you do research in these fields that link technology to national security. And within that umbrella, then different institutions will decide to be part of that conversation or not. Lastly, communication. I think there is an endeavor, it's what I call the 3C, right? Coordination, cooperation, and communication. Both internally, domestically, as well externally to others. AUKUS at the moment is victim of its own success, relative speaking, in the sense that public awareness about what AUKUS is, particularly Pillar 2, but also in some respects Pillar 1, what AUKUS is, what AUKUS does, can do, is very different. Domestically in the three countries, I don't think that the UK debate is in the same space as the Australian debate. And having travelled frequently to Australia, I think there is a significant gap in that sense. But at the same time, I think there is a concerted effort to have a better capacity for communication outwardly. Right, also to very interested areas of the world that are looking at AUKUS with a keen eye. And here I'm thinking Southeast Asia, but not just Southeast Asia. Even in places as far as the Western Indian Ocean, you'll have actors that when they come together to talk about maritime security, they want to have an idea about what AUKUS is, precisely because of the broader ramifications that I implied to when I referred to the three bigger pillars. So for me, coordination, cooperation, and communication are three key consequences of these important changes. And now let me conclude with where the UK stands in all of this. I think the UK has been a consistent and an inherent component of the AUKUS conversation since day one. As a matter of fact, rumor has it that it was the first Sea Lord in the conversation with his counterparts in Australia that started this conversation about Australia introducing nuclear-powered submarines back in March 2021. During a visit of the first Sea Lord to Australia. But and politically, I think now is a well-accepted component of the national debate, and it's seen as a national security priority. Of course, it's one of a number of priorities, but in particular, what is essential to the UK is the idea that UK has been in Australia's position about 70 years ago, when it decided to go nuclear-powered and never come back. So from a UK perspective, AUKUS is even more existential than Australia, because we cannot go back to where we were. For us, there is no question that will be an SSN AUKUS or a next generation attack nuclear-powered submarine. So the question is how to keep everybody within that endeavor moving forward. That is clarity from this perspective across the political spectrum. Parliament is very supportive, and both Labour and Conservatives have been very clear about it. And I think everything that we're looking at coming out from Labour as the elections come up suggests that every single commitment already undertaken will be continued and will be part of a strategy in which AUKUS is not just a military endeavor that focuses on the Indo-Pacific. From a UK perspective, is about advanced capabilities that are applicable anywhere there is a patch of water, if I'm honest with you, certainly deeper than a couple of 100 meters to make it more operationally viable. And therefore, that applicability works in the North Atlantic, in the Euro-Atlantic context, or indeed in the Indo-Pacific. And two, it is an opportunity to link what the UK is aiming to do anyway, which is stand as a country with a competitive edge in science and technology to particular capabilities that will provide the asymmetric advantage for the type of medium-sized international looking power with the seat of the UN Security Council that the UK wishes to be. I'll stop it here. Thank you very much.
Hey, Alessio, I really appreciate that. And again, I'm really glad that we're recording this, because after the introductory comments from all three of our members here, I need to unpack this and then reassemble it so I can understand and ask more intelligent questions. But I think your frame of reference around the focus on undersea and on-sea warfare, which has been a strong feature of the updated National Defence Strategy here in Australia, is absolutely right. And the capital investment program flow that is adjusting as a result, it's not just about submarines, and whether it be, the Nord Stream issue we saw in your part of the world a couple of years ago, the issue around access and sea control in the Red Sea right now, or some of those UNCLOS and inappropriate behaviour, shall we say, on the high seas, which impacted a Royal Australian Navy helicopter some days ago. It's all elemental of this reminder, if you like, that the maritime domain of how the international system works is as important as ever. And I think those modalities of conflict that we're seeing right now, we've got the convergence of a land war in Europe. We've got the return to a degree of terrorism in the intersection of the enduring challenge of the Middle East, which is front of mind. And now we've got this issue in the Indo-Pacific, particular to East and North Asia, where the big wars historically tend to happen. It's all happening at the same time. We don't have the luxury of being able to adjust our modality and approach. We've got to deal with these issues, whether they converge or not. So again, really appreciate your points there. And the issue around deterrence and signalling, which we'll get to shortly, and the reinvigoration of the humanities and security studies element of defence and national power, I think is another element of AUKUS that is emerging as a need alongside the hard sciences as well. So I really appreciate that. Just coming back to yourself now, Under Secretary Jenkins, I'd be interested in any sort of thoughts and impressions you might have in relation to progress that we've made so far in the AUKUS frame, some of the elements around Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 dimensions, and also some of the challenges that you face. If I just put maritime to one side and I think about space, for example, in an AUKUS context, I know as a matter of fact that the UK space sector is 5 times bigger than the Australian space sector right now. And the UK space sector is 40 times smaller than the US space sector, which just speaks to, the fact that all three jurisdictions in terms of scale and ambition and uplift are all quite different, which, whether it be space, maritime, or another dimension of AUKUS, must make the challenge of cooperation and coordination all the more difficult. Have you got any sort of insights on that? And the other part to that is obviously we're moving through the regulatory environment at pace. I heard a very senior defence and government official describe our movement in Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 as all systems go. And certainly it must be one of those challenges around regulation and allowing the system to keep up with itself that keeps you occupied most days of the week. So any perspective on progress to this point and how we're sitting in a Pillar 1, Pillar 2 dimension certainly would be appreciated.
Great. Thanks for the questions and thanks for the input from everyone on the panel. I've listened and enjoyed all the input that everyone has provided, and the historical aspects. Took lots of notes because it's also helped me think about what's happening and put it in both historical and in a academic perspective. A couple things. It has been referenced already. There is so much that has been done already. I mean, when I think about where we started 2.5 years ago, and where we are now, it's really amazing. I mean, we're doing things that we questioned ourselves about whether we can actually get all of this done. Meeting the questions of others about whether this is really possible. We've done things at a much faster pace than we had anticipated. I will say a little bit more when we talk about the regulatory side of that. So just want to start by putting in a framework of how much we have already been accomplishing. There's so much that's happening, particularly on the government side, in terms of meetings and engagements that are happening amongst all three countries. Lots of travel amongst all three countries, with meeting with different parts of our government. And also, as I said earlier, the ways in which we want to incorporate all the different aspects of AUKUS, to include academia, as I mentioned, but also parts of human resources, making sure we have what we need in terms of future generations. I visited the shipyards in Norfolk and spoke to at the apprentice school there, and the excitement that they have in terms of the young people engaging in AUKUS and the future. So there's a lot that's happening in terms of the different parts of AUKUS in Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, but also all the different actors. There's in terms of training that we've been doing with Australian personnel that are training at our Pearl Harbor shipyard, for example. We've had some individuals from both the UK at the US schools, Australians who are graduating from there and from US and UK schools that are happening. Just looking at, there's been a lot of engagement with our industries, a lot of speaking to industries and making sure that they're aware of what's happening. As I mentioned earlier, where all three countries are, working with their industries, getting a response in terms of regulations that we're going to be putting in place to allow for more easy exchange and with industry and with technology. That's going on right now. So an industry is very interested and very excited about all aspects of AUKUS. So there's a lot that's going on there. There's a lot in terms of Pillar 2, with governments working together to think about ways in which we are going to promote Pillar 2 amongst the 6 types of emerging technologies. And also, you referenced the work that's going on with the regulations. I mean, both Australia and the UK, as well as the US, have all adopted legislation that's going to allow for much easier access and much easier transfer of technology and technical knowledge itself. Want to commend both the UK and Australia for all the new legislation that they put in place, including Australia's Defence Trade Controls Amendments and Bill and Safeguarding Australia Military Secrets Bill, the UK's National Security Act and National Investment Security Act, which came into force, of course, our NDAA in the US. And all of this represents a lot of hard work that has gone into making this happen. In the US, for example, a process that normally takes 6 to 12 months in terms of our regulations, we've done it, we're working in like 4 months. And it meant a lot of meetings for us, as well as UK and Australia, a lot of meetings on the Hill here in the US, in Washington, D.C. And we'll still be having regular engagements with our Congress on this, which has been very supportive of this. We have a strong bipartisan support for AUKUS, which has been very helpful in funding AUKUS. So that has been great. That has been very positive. As I said, up to more than 80% increase in the amount of ability of our to do transfers of technology with both the Australia and the UK. And so this is going to be very important, particularly for Pillar 2, because we want it to be very interoperable, all the technologies we're talking about. And so being able to have regulations that allow us to transfer amongst each other is very important. On the question about coordination cooperation, as was already stated, there's a long history of work between the US and the UK on the national security side, but also a long history in terms of our engagement. So I think we started out with a really strong basis, a really strong foundation for what we can do with the UK and Australia in terms of our history in working with these two countries. So I think that was a very good decision in terms of starting AUKUS and working amongst all three countries. The cooperation, coordination, and communication that was highlighted is something that we recognize and something that we want to do. And I look at all of these as opportunities. I know there's challenges, but just being inspired by what we've been able to do so far in terms of what we can do in the future, the interoperability, as I mentioned, as we work on these 6 technologies, for example, and what we can learn from each other, and with our expertise, both inside and outside government, is going to be incredible. And I think that's going to be one of the major aspects of AUKUS in addition to Pillar 1, being able to bring in more partners. So regardless of where countries are in terms of their own technology right now, I think we're going to be able to build on that and take advantage of the gaps that exist that we can learn from each other. And I think that's one of the things that's going to be most important as we figure out where all 3 countries are in terms of the different technologies and how we can develop all together and be interoperable, I think is the highlight. So I'll leave it at that. But just to say how much has been done, how much we look forward to what we will be doing in the future, and the aspects of what we're doing in training and the human side of it is really, really important. So thanks for that.
Yeah, thanks, Ambassador. I mean, I would just make the comment that the regulatory reform that's been committed to by all 3 countries has been impressive by any measure, inside and outside of sort of, wartime emergencies. And that's a great credit to all involved. I mean, the other piece that you touched on briefly is just the skilled workforce as a rate determining factor in terms of training and qualifying people in parallel with these technology uplifts. There's about, as I understand it, 44,000 British are directly involved in nuclear stewardship in terms of that element of industry, and Australia's got to grow to at least that in very short order in the context of AUKUS Pillar 1. And there's no better example of how to bring scale to that problem than buildsubmarines.com. So if anyone's not been to that website, if you want to understand how to levy en masse, if you like, a skilled workforce, then that's certainly the way to do it in 2024. So really appreciate your comments. Just for our audience, and I note that the Q&A box is now open, so feel free to populate that with questions. If we don't get to them today, then we'll certainly follow up. I just want to quickly turn now to a couple of issues: space, cyber, and deterrence, and any sort of comments from an AUKUS or indeed Australian, US, or UK perspective as it might relate to matters at hand. And again, I'll ask John to sort of kick off on that to take the conversation to the next level. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Ian. Great to be part of this. It's really a fascinating conversation. So we've seen already, and I think Alessia has touched on this, particularly on the space, the comparison of what Australia's got to offer versus the UK and then the United States. We're significantly a long way behind, and it's been unfortunate that Australia's taken some decisions in the last 12 months or so that have, I would put to you that they've stunted our prospect of having a significantly increased space capability in the coming years, which I think is a real missed opportunity, and hopefully one that will be recovered in the near future. On the cyber front, we've seen, and we make the point in Revealing Secrets, that the SIGINT world has gone through what I call a Copernican revolution, with the 4th industrial revolution, when things went from analog to digital. The computing expertise, the ability, the people who knew how to protect capabilities, protect computer systems, were hoodie-wearing, basement-dwelling, introverted geeks who worked inside, no such agencies, who that were essentially not really prone to being terribly extroverted and out there. But they have now been shoved into this space where they've got a mission to reach out to the world through, in the Australia's case, the Australian Cyber Security Centre, with Abigail Bradshaw being in charge of really making sure that the Australian government, I should say, and its partners internationally work collaboratively to muscle up in terms of cyber security, because I like to say we've gone from being web enabled to web dependent, and in turn web vulnerable, and this device here is one of the key vulnerabilities. We love it, we can't part with it, and yet it is making us more vulnerable than ever. So many things that once upon a time when I was a kid, you had to go to you had to go to an office and you filled out a form and you did things. Nowadays, you just do it on an app on your phone. And that's wonderful, but it's also incredibly vulnerable, makes us very vulnerable to disruption. And that prospect of disruption is a real one. So when we're thinking about AUKUS capabilities, it's so important that Pillar 2 is part of that equation, because if we're just relying on cutting steel and on technology, hard power technology can look at and touch, we're missing a large part of the action, and that certainly goes to the question of deterrence as well. So I think on the cyber front, we're actually getting pretty good. Where there's the Essential 8 is now widely circulated. The kinds of cyber attacks that my own university, the ANU, was subject to a few years ago, don't want to, jinx us, but we are now much better postured than we were. We're now much more robustly defending ourselves from intrusion and cyber attack. So that's really good. On the deterrence front, there's a question there, and there's an ongoing debate about what kind of deterrence, what does deterrence really mean, and how does AUKUS actually help deter? Well, for starters, Australia is not a nuclear weapons country, but we are part of a network of security relationships, most consequentially, of course, with the United States, where we look to the nuclear capabilities of the United States as part of the guarantor function of the so-called rules-based global order that we kind of know and love so well. But what does a submarine bring to deterrence? Is it we're not going to be able to take on any great power on our own, but I think the key thing is, if you're only looking at what Australia brings to the table on its own, you're missing the point. This is, I think, about bolstering the resolve of a coalition of countries to think constructively about deterrence, to think constructively and in a visionary long-term way about how you pursue your interests in a way that works by leveraging off the capabilities of like-minded countries that have shared interests, an overlap of interests. And I think there's an important point here when you're thinking about interests and values. People, there's a kind of tendency in certain circles to lampoon the shared values and say, well, Australia and the United States, what shared values? Well, I would put to you that there are some significant and enduring overlapping values about liberal democracy that, despite all the criticism in the media, endures to this day. But beyond that, of course, is what I think is perhaps the most important aspect, and that's the enduring overlap of our interests. They've overlapped for the better part of 80 plus years. And that overlap, from my, in my looking at through the crystal ball, shows no sign of going away. Those overlapping interests are likely to endure, and they involve looking to deter an authoritarian and expansionist approach from not just China, but now also from Russia, from Iran and North Korea, and anyone else who wants to join that club. And we've just seen Australia's been participating in the attempts to deter North Korea with the UN sanctions that we were looking to contribute to enforce around North Korea, and that China and the Russians appear to have walked away from. But this is really, you know, it's a very important one now to think about how we do deterrence, given that we've got limited capability. And as the great power equation shifts, as we see the massive expansion, particularly of Chinese capabilities, as we see the alignment, the closer alignment between Russia and China, we see North Korea supplying munitions to Russia, we see Iran contributing drones and other technologies to Russia. The deterrent equation has shifted. And if we think about how we can contribute to deterrence without contributing to the prospect of the great heightening prospect of war, this does require some astute reflection on us muscling up, while, you know, to quote Teddy Roosevelt, with that great axiom, you know, of speaking softly but carrying a big stick. And this is, I think, particularly pertinent in light of the news over the last couple of days about the Australian helicopter that was strafed by the Russian fighter and had flares fired in front of it. I think what we've seen out of the Philippines is instructive, and this is where we're concerned about things happening in dark corners. It's important that we don't respond in kind, but we shed light. We expose this. We expose it for what it is, and we put it very clearly for people to see, and we make it clear that our partners in the region, in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, see what's going on and appreciate the efforts we are making to pursue interests that we share with them as well, share interests we have in common, and that includes continuing to pursue an attempt at deterrence that is, you know, around the edges, it becomes a little bit fuzzy about how you execute it, because when you talk about deterrence in principle, but in practice, it gets very difficult when you think, okay, well, how do we actually respond now to this particular instance today? I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, John. And again, I mean, you touched on a really important point, that deterrence in the notion of, you know, what middle powers can or can't do, particularly to quote sort of Luke 1Q, when you're a little fish surrounded by a big fish, and something about a poisoned shrimp. Deterrence is a real challenge for countries like Australia, and, you know, I would submit to, you know, modern day Japan and others, which are faced with the same issue. And so in that context, just turning to yourself, Alessio, you know, I'd be interested in sort of any thoughts or insights you might have in relation to just Japan specifically being a part of some dimension of AUKUS Pillar 2. I mean, some in the international system would talk about AUKUS through an Anglo-spheric historical context, and that's not meant to be complementary. And in that respect, I mean, there is great utility in Japan as a friend and a partner, but also, you know, a really important component of potentially Pillar 2 being able to offset that ill-founded belief, but also bring great potential to these collaborations. And John made the point around where there are potentially inconsistencies in investments in space in Australia, and the gap that might open up in an AUKUS context. How a country like Japan, with such a, you know, an ambitious space program, might be able to help fill that out. So any sort of insight you might have on that will be appreciated. And we've got some good questions from Dr. Lee Willett as it relates to seabed deterrence. And if there's any insight you might want to provide on that before we wrap up, that would be really appreciated. Thanks. We might just come off mute, I think, Alessio. That's okay. It's okay. I do it all the time.
Yeah, yes, despite the habit one should have developed by now. Sorry. So a couple of quick points. Let me take the Japan question first, because I think you know, Japan, and I think the comment on Japan lands nicely after what Ambassador Jenkins and John have said, because you've got elements of the positive side that unfolding from what John was saying, and elements that need to overcome from what the ambassador was saying when it comes to Japan, in the sense that, first of all, big picture, Of course, Japan is the best antidote in many ways to the very often played bullet point of Chinese diplomats, or the bullet points the Chinese diplomats provide to everybody else who's willing to take them, about the Anglo-Saxon sort of convergence of late, right? So there is that story that obviously whether it comes in the shades of oh, but this is obvious because of the Five Eyes and all these secretive, nebulous things that are all the darker sides of the West, right? So Japan, having been an actor that has invested enormously into the shaping of the security landscape through a constructive engagement of how to make the security landscape in the broader Indo-Pacific and certainly in Southeast Asia more resilient, becomes a very important, powerful voice to enlist to sort of push back on that. And of course, from a Japanese perspective, you also want to be careful not to become the pawn into that story. You want to make sure that you are joining a narrative that is a positive narrative in that sense. So it goes back to the communication point that we were discussing earlier. But underneath that broader sort of big picture kind of conversation, what does Japan would bring to the equations? Of course, Japan has had significant investments into space program, and the latest changes through the national security strategy and the new defense strategy emphasize counter-strike capability, advanced ISRT capabilities, all elements, if you want, of a picture that is very compatible, particularly with the Pillar 2 dimension. So if you want, in terms of national security fabric and grammar, Japan is already in a space that is very leaning towards a Pillar 2 friendly environment in terms of conversation. But on top of that, of course, Japan brings advanced technology and science and a long-standing investment in both areas. Japanese universities in some of these areas still rank at the very top of any international list, no matter how you calculate it. And of course, also the financial support to make that happen, the investment. So even when we're talking about recently, there were talks about New Zealand, Canada, Japan becomes a really interesting sort of partner when compared to other members of the Five Eyes community, because it has some pockets of excellence, both in terms of its research and science and the sheer, if you want, capacity of it, that very few other contributors can have. However, and here we go into the point that Ambassador Jenkins was making, which I think is absolutely central. Japan is making incredible progress on improving its information security procedures. It's introducing new legislation for defense exports and defense collaborations, but at the same time, is in a very different place, and it's very far from where any one of the AUKUS members are. So in that sense, what you have there, a situation with Japan that becomes an interesting partner, not just for the positive things that it brings, but also because of its inherent limitations, particularly from a regulatory and normative space, which forced the entire AUKUS group, if you want, especially if it's not just on the individual project, to start thinking, okay, let's stop for a second. Let's be ambitious, and if we were king for a day, what we would want AUKUS to be, from my perspective, the ambitious version of any AUKUS Pillar 2 story, it's some sort of FTA of defense, or dare I say, a CPTPP of defense. You set an environment, that is as ambitious as you can be, right? But that's when you have partners outside the original three. And of course, that throws all sorts of sparmers in the works. And only an academic could say that and be comfortable with the idea, because we are problem creators and not problem solvers by design. But if we have that conversation, I think that's what having a trusted partner means all about. Right now, specific on Lee's question. Lee's questions are very important, and at the same time, quite challenging. From my perspective, when we're talking about seabed warfare and where AUKUS sort of fits into all of this, first of all, we're thinking about detection systems to increase your capacity to have a better domain awareness in the seabed and undersea domain in anything that is home waters and going out into your EEZs. And also a possibility to enhance your capacity to better patrol and monitor your undersea critical infrastructure up to a point, because your critical undersea infrastructure, they're not just national, they're also international. So there are limits to that. But from my perspective, when we're talking about seabed warfare and things to focus and concentrate on, anything that connects not only the system fits at the seabed, as well as the one that you can put on the sub that enable to multiply your capacity to make the undersea domain, particularly at depth, slightly more transparent, definitely it's a very important thing. In fact, it's crucial. And mind you, people keep saying that the undersea domain is transparent. It is not at the depths in the Indo-Pacific and not at the greater depths. The amount of noise and acoustic disturbances that still exist make the whole proposition that you can operate undersea in the same way you operate on land is absolutely ridiculous. So and you know, it should be pushed back quite heavily as soon as people start going down that road, unless you are within the 12 nautical miles from coastal areas, but that's a slightly different place, and you might all be dead in trying to do that. So you know, the story changes there. Specifically on the rotation west, I think, and I'll close on this, I think what's going to be interesting is going to be how, in a context whereby in Australia you have a clean slate, again, in Australia you have this once in a lifetime opportunity to sit down and say, like, right, I need to do this thing. In the ideal world, how would you want to do it so that it lasts for the next 200 years? That's what you can do, whether you're in Adelaide or in Western Australia, in Perth. So in that sense, I think what's going to be really interesting is how to experiment with a supply chain system to service submarines going there that is as streamlined as possible and as interchangeable as possible across the three countries and the boats they operate, because for a certain period of time, rotation west will have different type of boats going in and out, and so servicing that in order to maximize the potential of their launching pad is going to be absolutely essential, and that real logistical support critical to it. Over.
Yeah. Hey, Leslie, I really appreciate that. And again, this conversation could go for ages. I like the idea of being a problem maker and not a problem solver, but I don't want to make a problem for Ambassador Jenkins. We've got a hard stop. So on behalf of everyone, I just want to appreciate all of you and your participation today. I want to recognise the launch of the AUKUS Briefing Book. I want to thank, again, the facilitators of this activity. And I really want to thank our audience that grew over the brief and have stayed pretty stable across. So we'll make sure that we maintain contact with you and continue to provide this very important service in the broader context of what S&D does via the collaboration between ASU, King's College and UNSW. So Ambassador Jenkins, Professors Blaxland and Padalano, thank you very much for your time. Looking forward to meeting you again in person and all the very best in what you do. And thanks for your service. Appreciate it. Cheers.